Okay, all right. So, dear students, dear colleagues, I am Katerina Zaharia, Professor of Classics and Director of Classics and Archaeology Learning Community Program, which we launched in August 2022 following the pandemic. CLAT 4400 is the name of the one-unit course which aims to enrich students' experience as they acquire academic skills and habits of engaging in conversation with diverse subject matter over interdisciplinary programs. We're grateful to BCLA Dean Professor Richard Forks for his support of our program and welcome him to our event today. It is with great joy and a healthy amount of pride that I take this opportunity to introduce Dr. Jordan Christopher, LMU alum, my former student, current colleague, a lecturer in the LMU Department of Classics and Archaeology since August 2022. I have known Dr. Christopher Jordan since his undergraduate years at LMU University, 2009 to 2013, during which time he had distinguished himself as one of the most dedicated students of classics, with an inquisitive mind and a keen interest in Greco-Roman history, language and literature, and the Chinese language and literature. Since Jordan earned his BA with a double major in Classics and East Asian Studies in 2013, we kept in touch during his graduate studies across 3 countries, diverse educational systems, where he honed an admirable set of research tools and expertise. Jordan earned master's degrees in comparative classical Greek and Chinese historiography from Durham University in England in 2015 and in Chinese philosophy from East China Normal University in 2017, and a PhD focusing his research on the periphery kingdoms of Macedon and Queen from McGill University in Canada and Münster University in Germany in 2022. Dr. Christopher already has an enviable publication record at the young age of 32 years old. His monograph, The Pioneer Kingdoms of, let me just do this so we can get to our monograph. Hold on. Let's pull it up from down, I think here. There. There. Let's just open this up. Okay. So his monograph, The Pioneer Kingdoms of Macedon and Queen, A Triumph of the Periphery, was published in June 2025 by Cambridge University Press in the series Antiquity in Global Context. In addition, Jordan has published 2 articles in edited volumes, one in the Journal of Ancient History, and has 3 more peer-reviewed articles at Press in 2025-26, and an edited volume contracted with Routledge. In May, he spoke at the Chinese Philosophy Symposium by invitation in New York City, hosted by the China Institute in America, on his theory of diasporic elements inherent in the early Chinese experience, manifested in the text of early Confucian philosophy. 2 weeks ago, he gave an invited talk at University UPenn on elite families of Rome and China. At LMU, Dr. Christopher teaches a course on ancient historians, introducing students to Greek and Chinese historiography. He also redesigned an upper division course on theories of the axial age, as well as new courses on war in society in the Greco-Roman world and early China and ancient Greece. Dr. Christopher is an indefatigable colleague who brings a breath of fresh air and numerous new ideas for student recruitment. For instance, he participates enthusiastically in the freshman preview days, dressed as a Roman legionary, and revived the Saturnalia festival at the end of the fall semesters in 2023 to 25. And he also served as a research supervisor for several undergraduate student theses in the Asian and Asian American Studies department, securing cross-list for all his courses. Dr. Christopher goes above and beyond to animate the text they analyze in class by initiating in spring 2023 a Roman reenactment project for LMU students. He volunteered to instruct students step by step how to handcraft their own period accurate caligae, the Roman military sandals, tunic and belt, out of leather and linen. He procured several sets of Roman armor, helmets, shields with the Classics and Archaeology Department's annual Dionysus Festival, in 23, 24, and 25, giving the opportunity to students to be equipped as an early Imperial Roman legionary and in cooperation with the Legion VI Historical Society, be instructed in Latin in a Roman military drill and march across campus. Dr. Christopher has established a relationship with the Getty Villa and attracted 2 rounds of funding from the Society of Classical Studies through the Ancient World's Modern Communities program, which is intended for outside the classroom projects that bring the ancient world into other contexts. Our Learning Community program was one of the sponsors for a 2-day academic conference on Kin and Clan in Roman Antiquity, New Perspectives on the Roman Family, which Dr. Christopher, along with Dr. Elliot Quiroz, hosted in spring 2025. An impressive group of international scholars in Roman studies with expertise in traditional literary and historical studies, comparative analysis, slavery studies, and digital humanities studies presented their cutting-edge research at LMU on February 28 until March 1, 2025. The proceedings will be published as a special series in the scholarly journal Greece and Rome, with a manuscript due in April 2026. This short introduction shows how Dr. Christopher is a dedicated teacher-scholar who draws on his academic experiences in 5 countries and 2 languages, conducts comparative research in ancient historiography, practices inclusive pedagogy, and has proven himself to be a reliable and eager colleague determined to share his expertise and enthusiasm with a new generation of young students. Today, we're celebrating the book launch for his monograph, The Pioneer Kingdoms of Macedon and Queen, a book that critically compares the cultures of ancient Greece and early China in the first millennium BC, through following the histories of 2 of its peripheral cases, Argead Macedon and Queen. As indicated in the Cambridge University Press description, the monograph provides a framework by which classicists can gain insight into ways in which sinology can help further the study of Greece and Rome, and vice versa. It offers a comparative study of Alexander the Great and the first emperor of China, revealing how great kings are inherently culminations of their specific cultural historical trajectories. Dr. Christopher undertakes a holistic comparison of Greek and Zhou cultures from the earliest origins to the reigns of Alexander the Great and the first emperor, analyzing the dynamics of identity in ancient Greece and early China, and deepening an appreciation of the unique features of ethnic discourse in both cases. Let's welcome Dr. Jordan Thomas Christopher.
Thank you, everyone. So, we don't have that much time, so we'll just get right into it. Pioneer Kingdoms is a work of comparative history which traces the culturally informed political and historical developments of the Argead Kingdom of Macedon from the 9th to 4th centuries BC and the Qin state of the Zhou dynasty from the 8th to 3rd centuries BC. Now, briefly, for those who aren't familiar with it, the Kingdom of Macedon is a polity far to the north of mainland Greece. The term for it derives from Macedones, which in Greek derives out of something like Highlander. They live in the mountains. It's cold up there. It's not where you'd want to take your Greek vacation at all. It was established sometime in the 800s, but we don't really know much about it until the reign of its king Amyntas I in the mid-6th century. We know that when the Persians invaded Greece, there was a clear impact on Macedonian development, and we see very clearly the king Alexander I of Macedon, who tries to depict himself consciously as Greek. He wants to compete in the Olympics. He wants to be known as the Philhellene. He wants to bring Greek poets to his court. He's trying to show others, no, really, I'm Greek. But when you look at it, they may be trying too hard. Herodotus tells us that they are Greeks according to them, right? It's indicating a little bit of, I'm not sure. And if you go to later eras, the uncertainty heightens, where you have Demosthenes giving a very politically charged speech against the Macedonian king, saying that he is in fact not only not Greek, he is in no part Greek. And he is not even a barbarian from anywhere worth naming. He is a plague from Macedonia, from where it was never before possible even to buy a decent slave. Against the kingdom of Macedon, I will compare the state of Qin, later the dynasty of Qin. Now, Qin is initially just one of a whole bunch of little insignificant polities founded by the kings of the Zhou dynasty. We don't need to get into the specifics of their ancestry, who their kings were in this early period. A lot of our sources on this are very iffy. But what is important is that from very early on, the polity of Qin is given a sort of special role as fighting barbarians on the frontier. During the collapse of the power of the Zhou dynasty, the state of Qin seems to have remained very loyal and told, even though we, the kings of Zhou, are losing our homeland, if you, the rulers of Qin, can take it back, you can have it. Right? Thus beginning centuries of what you might compare to Indian wars in the early Chinese plains, where the state of Qin retook the ancestral homeland of the Zhou dynasty and made it their own domain. But when we get more textual information in the later Warring States period, it appears to us that the state of Qin is not quite normal somehow. Something's wrong with them. They are sort of barbarians, but it depends on who you ask and when. We see constant comparisons of barbarian ancestry. We have observations that there are no Confucians. There are no Confucians in Qin, and that scholars are sometimes afraid to go out there. And more importantly, sometimes the Qin itself use that as part of their marketing. They seem to accept that. And so you have very politicized statements. The people of Qin are Eastern barbarians. Qin is the adversary of the whole world, all under heaven. The Qin have common customs with Rong and Di. These are barbarians. They are greedy, profit-seeking, untrustworthy, know nothing of ritual righteousness, virtuous conduct. This is common knowledge throughout the world. I engage the histories of these two polities specifically because, for those who examine them on even a cursory level, the cultural places and historical trajectories of Argead, Macedon, and Qin appear uniquely parallel. Both were culturally semi-outsiders with no constant contemporary consensus and transmitted sources on their belonging among the greater Greek or Zhou cultural worlds. Changes in larger Greek and Zhou political constellations, as well as Macedonian and Qin societal developments, shifted perspectives on them and their identities. Both existed at the geographic periphery of their larger cultural worlds before their military and political power explodes in the 4th century. Both would then forcibly unify their cultural spheres, dominating them for a few decades, and then collapsing as quickly as they had arisen. The unifications brought about by these states cast them as culture brokers, if not quite culture unifiers, permanently changing the trajectory of Greek and Chinese histories, and indeed what it means to be Greek or Chinese. Their greatest leaders, Alexander III, the so-called Great, and Ing Zheng, the first emperor of Qin, also known as the first emperor of China itself, cast their own long shadows forward into history. However, their time in the limelight of grand historical narrative is fleeting for both polities. Despite their towering achievements and enduring legacies, many aspects of their histories and cultures remain unclear, though I have shed, I hope, a bit more light on the topic through my work. What interests me and underlies my research approach is, however, not the vast number of similarities between Macedon and Qin, but in the differences with which these two entities handled extremely similar challenges and circumstances. Methodologically, my approach is known as causal narrative comparison. This approach, quite common in the humanities, involves comparing two cases to better highlight multivariate differences between them, before then attempting to explain these differences through causal sequential analysis in a narrative form. For example, in one of the many comparisons in this work, it is noted that Macedon does not significantly bureaucratize its governmental institutions, but Qin does. This highlighted difference is then explored by recourse to explaining what features are present or absent in both Macedon and Qin that would cause such differential outcomes. The result of this minor analysis becomes then a factor by which to explain further outcome differences. This study, though based around similarities and parallels between Macedon and Qin, uses comparative approaches to identify peculiarities of Macedon and Qin, both obvious and subtle. By examination of one case and its source evidence, one learns to ask new questions of another case and its own body of evidence. Firstly, given their shared experience of political fragmentation, how structurally similar or different were the dynamics of Greek and Zhou identities? Secondly, what were the major concerns and dynamics of political societies in Macedon and Qin? Despite experiencing remarkably parallel developments, what dynamics marked their similarity and what marked their differences? And what were the consequences of these differences? Thirdly, how were these societies informed by the historical cultural realms that they inhabited? And how was this culturally informed influence impactful on real behaviors and activities? Lastly, at the individual level, what activities were undertaken by the Macedonians and Qin rulership in their brief period of dominance astride the world? While all empires face similar operational challenges, what were the methods used to surmount these obstacles? And how were these methods culturally informed and path-dependent? By this method, bodies of historical evidence as thoroughly mined by millennia of academics as the historiographies of ancient Greece and early China can be made to yield new and fresh insights into such matters as Greek and Chinese ethnic identity, the rise of the polis, early Greek and Chinese warfare, and the reigns of Philip II, Alexander the Great, and the first emperor of Qin. In sum, in the asking of such questions as comparison inspires, what is old is made new. In undertaking a study of Macedon and Qin, attention must particularly be paid to the unique cultural place of Macedon and Qin in the eyes of our Greek and Zhou textual sources. It is well known to classicists that both the Argead clan and Macedonians themselves are a topic of rather intense controversy regarding the question of their ethnic and cultural identity. Our sources are politically charged and at times contradictory, and do not provide unanimity on the question of, are Macedonians Greeks? The resulting uncertainty as to the exact place of the Macedonians is the key feature of their cultural peripherality. The case for Qin is quite the same, with numerous Zhou sources seeming to accept Qin as part of the larger cultural us of the Xia, and others decrying Qin as animalistic, kin with barbarians. Comparing the peripherality of Macedonian and Qin cultures reveals difficulties in simply comparing Greek and Zhou cultures at all. To put it more bluntly, the cultural identities of the archaic and classical Greeks and of the Eastern Zhou Xia are of a type difference. There was not just difference in what it means to be Greek and what it means to be Zhou, but even the very categories by which these groups identified themselves seldom overlapped. Herodotus' famous categories of descent, language, and religious belief, categories where the Macedonians made clear claims to Hellenicity by claiming descent from Argos, adopting Attic, and participating in pan-Hellenic religious institutions, these were not judged along the same principles as equivalent aspects would be judged among the Zhou. Interestingly, despite the obsessive focus in Chinese society on kinship, imagined ancestry and kin ties were more essential in Greek notions of ethnic identity than they were among the Zhou. The language of the majority of Qin subjects is never brought up as a point of interest, and there is no equivalent to, for example, the line in the poet Stratus mocking the speech patterns of the men of Macedon. The Qin aristocrats who are depicted in our sources are perfectly capable of operating in the speech of the Xia. Their written scripts as well do not mark them as distinct, and far less is written on Qin speech as being noteworthy than on Macedonian speech, as rarely attested as that is. Comparing religious practice is difficult, but it is noteworthy that for the Greeks, religious rituals, sacrificial meals, and sacred games were mass events intended for crowds and audiences. For the Zhou, such matters were exclusive, public only insofar as elites gathered to pay respect to their superiors, or otherwise private to family, clan, or the top tier of governing personnel. This point of difference can very clearly be linked to the presence of citizenship traditions among Greeks and the absence of such traditions among the Zhou. It is perhaps unsurprising that we see confirmation of Greek identity of the archaic and classical period being heavily communitized. It was an identity of and for mass groups, akin to ethnicity as sentiment or emotion, something that occurred naturally and not artificed. Contrastingly, the Zhou identity of the spring and autumn period became a form of high culture, restricted to only those few who would intentionally practice it. This state of affairs has an obvious historical cause, the collapse of the Zhou royal domain in the 8th century. The Zhou polities east of their homeland in the Guanzhong Basin were essentially minority rulers over masses of ethnically foreign inhabitants. And as states increased control over these groups, the need to preserve identity against possible bastardization increased accordingly. Qin, being itself ancestrally barbarian, was recognized as legitimate by the Zhou Wangs themselves and was unified with other Zhou states in the basic condition that the cultural identities of the elites and the masses were separate concerns. What occurred in the Zhou world following the 8th century was in some sense no different than the dynamic that has occurred in countless cases among diasporic groups throughout human history. An insular turn accompanied by intense and intentional maintenance of particular cultural dynamics that the group has been severed from, creating a second evolutionary path from the lost homeland that often sees some elements frozen in time. And I have written on exactly how Zhou identity became diasporic in greater detail in a forthcoming article with early China. Oh, sorry. There we go. But this is not what seems to have occurred in Macedon. It seems reasonably clear by now that the native practices of religion and linguistic affiliation of the Macedonians were, however, distinct enough to cause problems. By their adoption of Attic for official uses, by the performative nature of argaiads inviting Greek poets to court, by the late creation of a locally oriented Macedonian athletic competition, the Macedonian aristocracy were obviously trying to intentionally perform a Hellenicity that was different than the local native Hellenicity that seems discernible to modern scholars in Macedon as Macedonian. For the Greeks to their self, viewing these displays, the artifice of such performance was not to its credit. Whereas the studied imitation of high Greek culture is essentially exactly equivalent to how Qin and other states could lay claim to Zhou identity, the somewhat dubious results of such imitation by the Macedonians strongly indicates the nature of Greek identity as being seen, at least in part, as innate and natural. In copying the expressions of Greek identity, the Macedonians could not copy the cause of such expressions. Their performed Hellenicity was smoke without fire. Macedon was a kingdom among oligarchies and democracies, and the consequent custom differences between Macedon and the polis societies further south is significant. In this matter, one sees local dynamics and concerns appropriate these Athenian productions in the vein of Arjuna Padarai's notion of the indigenization of cricket in India. The court of the Argaiad Basileus in Macedon would have been filled with the aristocratic hetairoi, hailing from all over the Argaiad dominion as well as elite foreign guests. Whereas Athenian plays in Athens are a form of mass culture, in Macedon their performance must be seen as tied up in more exclusive and elite identities. Indeed, as the 5th century tragedian Sophocles remarked, whoever goes to a tyrant becomes his slave, no matter how free he arrived. The adoption of Greek practices by the court of Macedon thus could never have been viewed as a case of Greeks participating in a shared Greekness. The very structures of Macedonian society ensured it was adapted and appropriated in a local Macedonian context that rendered it somehow alien to Greek onlookers. In a sense, the mass identity that was Hellenicity was transformed in Macedon into an identity of privilege, inextricably bound to the Basileus and his companions like everything else in that land. Therefore, Macedonian customs were not just vastly different from Greek equivalents, but their adoption of indisputably Greek cultural expressions necessarily were distortions of meaning beyond what could have been easily recognizable. In the field of post-colonial studies, Homi K. Bhabha has given a name to such distortions: mimicry. Macedonian adoption of practices such as athletic festivals and Attic theater was mimicry for the Macedonian court, and it was viewed by Athens as never possible for Macedon to entail a true alteration of itself. Given this key point of difference, the Hellenization of Macedon under Philhellenic policies of its basileis resembles the image of the anglicized Indian, whereby to be anglicized is emphatically not to be English. The Greek identity appears of a kind in this sense with its later English counterpart. The Greek identity was, at least in its own self-conception, innate and primordial, such that no mimicry could ever truly replicate it. Macedonians could be anglicized through adopting language, athletic competitions, poetry, and more, but they could emphatically never be English. That both Argaiad, Macedon, and Qin were governed by individual rulers atop their societies presents a clear opportunity for further comparison of rulership traditions and dynamics. Both rulers essentially embodied their states, though how this was achieved varied according to cultural practices. Most obviously, Qin rulership traditions were vastly less hands-on than one sees among Argead equivalents. From about the 6th century onwards, state rulers in Qin and elsewhere delegated command of armies to generals, and heads of state taking the field themselves becoming an extreme rarity. This shift parallels the move towards greater bureaucratization of Zhou states, wherein large assemblages of personnel were formed to carry out state policies. This evolution of rule led to ultimately what has been called the omnipotent rubber stamp model of governance, whereby early Chinese rulers held theoretically absolute power, but exercised it rarely, usually only selecting and approving from plans and policies presented to them by their subordinates. The contrast with Argead practice is extreme. As one notes, Argeads lead from the front. They are wounded and killed in action, and they are the motivating engine behind essentially every major state policy through the reign of Alexander the Great. However, earlier in its history, the leaders of Qin and other Zhou states appear to have been much more similar to Argead rulers. Given the close resemblance between the two rulership styles and numerous historical parallels between the two, I felt it important to ascertain why rulership evolved so differently in these cases. In seeking to explain these differing evolutions, I also noted that there were significant differences in models for the rulership in these cases. The Zhou states, including Qin, were emplaced by the Zhou king, the Wang, during the rise of the Zhou dynasty. The Wang granted absolute control to singular individuals, and these themselves also oversaw an early bureaucratic realm. The concept of a basileus, however, was comparably closer to a notion of being a first among equals. Recent work has asserted the effective absence of hereditary aristocracy in archaic Greece, with social elites needing to validate their position through constant demonstrations of ability. One also notes that there were, in fact, other basileis in Macedon besides the Argead clan head. The result of this state of affairs was what passed for an Argead state being extremely personalized and tied to the body and talents of the individual ruler in a way that Zhou states simply didn't match. These differing emphases meant that it was much easier for Zhou rulers to delegate tasks, as their own personal aptitudes become increasingly incidental to their rule, while at the same time meaning any Argead move towards deepening or bureaucratizing a nascent state would necessarily clash with the limitations of a singular physical person's ability to organize and govern. It is in this way we should understand the ability of Qin and later Han and further Chinese governmental structures to operate even with a child on the throne, whereas this was largely inconceivable or unacceptable among the Macedonians. Because the bureaucratized or non-bureaucratized developments of Qin and Macedon are so distinct, it has tremendous consequences for the development of later versions of these societies. I also, therefore, engaged in something of a tangential exploration of how far back you can trace these rulership different modes. I took my analysis back to Mycenae and Shang, and while I was forced to cut it from my book for space, I explored this in a dissertation and have that as a forthcoming paper as well. Let's see here. A further comparison I engaged in is the comparison of military structures. Both Qin and Macedon seem to have clear problems with their aristocracies, and yet they solve it with differing versions of the same solution. We're going to reform the society and the military at the same time. But how they launch these reforms are quite distinct. Macedon dilutes its aristocracy. It takes its commoners and renders them into pes hetairoi, foot companions, hetairoi being the term of the elite companions to the king. At the same time, it maintained its aristocratic traditions of cavalry. It maintained its aristocratic control. Qin, on the other hand, replaced its aristocracy. The reforms of the infamous Lord Shangyang dramatically curtailed the power of hereditary nobility entirely. There is very little emphasis at all on horse-based warfare in later Qin tradition. But one will note that even the most cursory understanding of Alexander the Great shows us the primary emphasis on the aristocratic cavalry in every battle that he fights. The result of these reforms, in the Macedonian case under Philip II, make it actually slightly more Greek. They introduce an assembly. And this mixes the role of the personal basileus with the institutional structures of the assembly, with mixed results. By giving soldiers a voice and by keeping the voice of the aristocracy, immediately tensions begin to arise between the two, and there is further resentment of the aristocracy, of the basileus who is performing these types of reforms. Meanwhile, the reforms that are undertaken by the state of Qin alienate it from the rest of China. Those of you who are familiar with early China at all may well be familiar with the reforms of Xiangyang, but as a brief summary, all of society is based around the taking of enemy heads. Right? One achieves rank in society by the number of enemy heads in battle you turn in to your general. If you do not turn in heads to your general, your family line will diminish in rank. The work of Xiangyang is explicit. It wishes to have the people kept in a constant state of terror of the state. No one can escape conscription. Everyone exists to serve the ruler. And it works for a time, but it leads to very distinct mercenarial behaviors from their soldiers. The soldiers are not given a voice, as they are in Macedon. It's a problem for Macedon that they have a voice. It's a problem for Qin that they don't. What we also see is that in its respective culture, there is no emphasis on the value of life for prisoners of war in the Chinese case. We might say, well, why would that be? I would argue, as I did in this book, that citizens have value inherently. When the Spartans are captured, when Athenians are captured, that you are capturing a segment of the state. When you capture 100,000 subjects of the state of Zhao, as happened after the Battle of Changping, they don't control anything. They are not part of their state, they are subjects, and thus, as Qin demonstrated, you bury them alive. Macedon, in contrast, operating in a much more Greek mode of thinking, is happy to take prisoners, happy to use them, takes prisoners after the infamous Battle of Chaeronea. We have multiple anecdotes about the prisoners taken following that battle. Moreover, famously among sinologists, we don't get great descriptions of what Chinese warfare looks like on the field. We don't get the long narratives of Herodotus or Thucydides, this line moves up, this guy lost his sandal, I dodged an arrow with my shield kind of stuff. We have only the vaguest descriptions. What my book allowed me to do through the comparison is to notice that warfare in the Greek context is tied up with social structure. And necessarily, if we have different social structures in Qin, maybe it leads to different conditions of warfare on the field as well. In a sort of lengthy study that I don't want to spend too much time on here, I argue that despite the tradition of much Chinese reception depicting the state of Qin in terms of its warfare as fully organized, beautiful, clean rows of lines, the structure of their society and the nature of the incentives mean that warfare must be chaotic. There are no lines, there are no phalanxes in the Qin state. There we go. Despite some claims to the contrary, evidence that Philip II attempted to induce divine honors for himself while he yet lived is inconclusive. However, it seems very clear that Alexander the Great wished to be so recognized. Alexander's supposed divinity was proven through acts which he had direct control over, particularly in military victories which he himself commanded. Yingzheng, the first emperor, in seeking to depict himself as a kind of god-king, was necessarily limited by the basic fact that he didn't actually do much. His steles take credit for achievements of his administration, for victories at battles he was not in command of, for projects he did not oversee, and other actions far removed from his immediate person. Compared to the Macedonian examples, one senses in the account of Yingzheng's life a discomfort with his necessary reliance on learned officials, and a desire to be taken more seriously as a person rather than just a title. He seems to have created the office of Huangdi, the title of emperor itself, as a way to fit a personal divinity into bureaucratic structures, as a way to assert his authority over better educated subordinates. There are further differences worth noting. Alexander's divinity needed to be accepted through worship and honors. The first emperor of China's divinity was simply proclaimed. Even Ing Zheng's new title, the Huangdi, is usually translated as emperor, but better translated as the August Thearch, following the translation of Euripides, rather than as emperor. Sacrifice and ritual customs among the Zhou were largely closed affairs as they pertained heavily to ancestor worship. As a result, mere political submission to the emperor was an affirmation of Ing Zheng's divine status. Furthermore, because he ruled through his state bureaucratic structures, there was a marked distance between himself and his subjects that he actively sought to increase by hiding his person and restricting knowledge of his whereabouts. Alexander, needing to demonstrate his godhood like every Argead monarch must demonstrate their authority generally, shows a notion of divinity wrapped up in accessibility, in display, and direct example, all totally alien from the equivalent case of early China. My brief comparison in this work of population redistribution efforts undertaken under the authorities of Macedon and Qin are also revealing. While Philip, Alexander, and Ing Zheng all forcibly relocated populations across their empires, the patterns of these activities are quite distinct. Qin redistributions are an order of magnitude larger than anything undertaken by Alexander, involving hundreds of thousands of people from Qin being moved outwards and from conquered areas being moved into Qin. The multidirectionality of these transfers is not paralleled in Macedon. Alexander appears to have been mostly limited in his foundations to whoever happened to be near at hand at the time. He was either unwilling or unable to send thousands of people from the Greek mainland to populate settlements across Asia. No Asians were sent to settle in Greece. It is also significant that these population transfers were not seen to expand Macedon, and that Alexander's domain and Macedon's borders were seemingly not coterminous. That the opposite policies and dynamics were explicitly pursued by Ing Zheng, down to labeling conquered lands as Nu Qin, seems to speak against any idea that Alexander's orientalizing was a genuine attempt to fuse the cultures under his rule. Instead, Alexander's Orientalist policies were only ever designed to solidify his personal authority over his subjects. Moreover, the comparison with Qin highlights clear limitations in what Alexander's limited state apparatus could achieve. It is difficult to conceive that Alexander could forcibly relocate hundreds of thousands of Greeks against their will while he was deep in Persia or even further afield. Macedonian redistributions, often bearing the name of the founder, often near the site of a victory, are such that the settlements themselves are a kind of outgrowth of the Greek trophy-making culture. Alexander's settlement activity, like Philip's, is here best understood as a kind of pragmatic Vergegenwärtigung, which is a complicated German word that seems to mean something like reaching back into the past and bringing it into the present. They are launching a Vergegenwärtigung of Greek myths regarding heroic activities and city foundations. Noting other arguments elsewhere in the book indicating clear tensions between Alexander and his Macedonian elites, the comparison is made to show further evidence that suggests that Alexander's Orientalizing seems to have been, like everything else undertaken by Macedonian rulers, fundamentally reactionary and opportunistic rather than systemic. Alexander's domain was dominantly Hellenic in character and mixed only in those ways he found personally useful, such as in reinforcing suggestions of his divinity to better entrench his authority and distance himself from his Macedonian aristocrats. There we go. And this distance between himself and his aristocrats is very much reflected in the issue of free speech. Now, free speech doesn't exist either in Macedon or Qin in the way we know it. The Greek term parrhesia is known among the Macedonians, but it's not a formalized institutional thing. But it does seem that among the Macedonians, at least among the elite Macedonians, there is an expectation of open talk. Elites can speak freely, even insult the ruler at times. We have numerous cases of Philip II being criticized, sometimes even being insulted, sometimes even by prisoners of war that he has captured, and he's okay with it. He has friends like Demaratus of Corinth who scold him for his personal problems with the relationships with his many wives. We have cases of insults at the symposia where the Macedonians get drunk and hurl insults at each other. And infamously, we have the case of Clytus the Black, the Macedonian aristocrat, who castigates Alexander as a tyrant and because of the presence of alcohol at that particular incident, Alexander gets drunk and runs him through with a spear. That does not seem to have been the expected result for anyone watching or for Clitus himself, however. In fact, in the early periods, the spring and autumn period particularly, most Zhou states are similar, and Qin was unexceptional in this aspect. But after the reforms of Shangyang, Qin becomes quite different. What we see are political agents, philosophers advising censorship, enforcing state terror. And the realm of free speech contracts only to a very formalized process involving remonstrations, in Chinese known as jian. You are allowed to say what you want if you are engaging formally in a jian. Anything else? No. And so when the high elites of the Qin court address the emperor, they take on subservient language that's alien to the Macedonian texts that we see. They talk of themselves as Chendeng, your slave or servant. When they offer the emperor a compliment, they say they do so mei si, risking death. When Chancellor Li Si proposes that the emperor become the emperor, the Huangdi, he says, I propose this at the risk of my own death. We'll skip around this case of example. What we see is that Alexander becomes aloof from his Macedonians as he fills his court with more foreigners. The access that they have expected changes. This creates a bit of an interesting paradigm because the Macedonians see a change in Alexander in only a few years that the state of Qin endured over a century. The result is that the Macedonian elites are free men who are watching their freedoms taken away. But by the time of the first emperor, no one remembers when you used to be able to speak freely to Chinese rulers. Thus, we note there are many cases of attempted assassinations of both Alexander and the first emperor. But one obvious difference is that the Macedonians themselves are trying to kill Alexander. Foreigners are trying to kill the first emperor. Why is this? Well, the Macedonian elites are watching as Alexander is stripping their freedoms away by being so successful at being the basileus. As he conquers more, as he fills his court with foreigners, they see their role diminish. Meanwhile, the first emperor's servants are employees. They are happy to have their jobs. They are well paid. They are collaborators. That said, for those Chinese states who are freshly conquered by the Qin, they are watching their freedoms be curtailed in real time, and that places them on very similar emotional footing to the Macedonian elites. Thus, where the Macedonians are trying to kill Alexander, they do so hoping that it would end the endless war that they are being dragged on. When the foreigners of other Chinese states are trying to kill the first emperor, they are participating in an early Chinese tradition valuing revenge. And we are low on time, so we're going to move right along. The ultimate result of these biographical comparisons, then, can be put simply. A comparison between Philip II and Alexander III's rule and that of the first emperor is a comparison between a man and a machine. Macedonian elites grew increasingly frustrated with Alexander as his personal power outgrew and then utterly eclipsed their own first as individuals and then as a group, as he attempted to entrench himself in autocratic norms. Yingzheng's own efforts at personal aggrandizement were restricted by the bureaucratic framework of Qin governance, where the ruler did not do much, especially compared against the Macedonian model. Even the first emperor's mode of self-divinization thus seems to have incorporated Qin's very bureaucratic trends into its formulation. One looks for and does not see significant Qin discontent at the elite level against Yingzheng's rule, finding instead the kind of loyalty one can expect from well-paid mercenaries among the highest holders of state office. Instead, visceral resentment is only discernible from non-Qin elites. One sees in the first emperor's administration not the rule of a single man as much as a central government, whereas in Macedon one sees clearly only the ruler and his personal communities. Alexander's long years abroad and continued exercise of authority suggests that whatever government one could speak of over Macedon was utterly irrelevant in the face of the willpower of a strong basileus. However, against the model of Qin, one sees the limitations of Alexander's power. It was not restricted by constitutional law or other frameworks, but instead by the very basic reality that one man cannot be everywhere at all times. Alexander, continually concerned with the establishing of his legacy and claims to heroic or even divine honors, and unable to force the issue of the latter, did little to ensure the stability of any Macedonian administration which followed him. Indeed, he seems to have been acting consistently with a view towards distancing his own authority from the wishes of the Macedonians as a whole. The Qin bureaucracy, empowered with the ideology of being the arm of the divine force that was the Huangdi, did not encounter such a problem. Rapid expansion in both cases produced overextensions of very different varieties. Alexander's reign saw the limitations of what one man and his individual connections could achieve. Ing Zheng's reign saw a bureaucratic system trying to process vastly more than it was capable of doing. The deaths of these figures ultimately saw overextension rapidly fade into collapse, but I have compared the collapses of these polities in a separate paper that I had presented in Münster and was published about a year ago in an edited volume. Comparison of Macedon and Qin reveals dynamics and trends in each case which come readily to prominence in a comparative analysis seeking to explain why each developed in its own particular way. The ultimate result of this, however, is somewhat paradoxical. The Macedonians, embodying their fundamentally Hellenic cultural milieu, operated along collectivist principles which gradually expanded to include a greater breadth of its population, which increasingly empowered a singular ruler whose personal and individual character and qualities were the beating heart of the function of society and state. Qin, a product of the Zhou cultural realm, developed a bureaucratic framework which relied on individual rewards, where a notionally absolute ruler left the actual mechanics of governance largely to ultra-talented but no less opportunistic individuals hired on as ministers and courtiers. Thus, Macedon rose and fell by the abilities, inclinations, and presence of its basileus. Qin rose and fell by the capabilities of its institutions, removed to a notable degree from the person of the ruler. Indeed, to examine them side by side, one is indeed confronted more than anything else by this distinction of man and machine. My larger conclusions, that cultural habits dynamically inform political evolutions in a path-dependent manner, are much wider reaching in their consequences. The cultural particularities that lead to the development of such critical elements of Hellenic culture as citizenship and its relationship to mass infantry warfare are currently insufficiently explained, as models of such things as the Hoplite Revolution would have suggested that China should have evolved around similar paths, but it did not. In this case and so many others, a large takeaway from my work becomes clear. My research is a warning against attempting to study political developments in a vacuum. In all cases, whether we study Greece, Rome, China, or 15th century Siberia, political actors are culturally informed, and highly coded and localized cultural dynamics play key roles in determining the evolutions of states and state-like entities. Humanity has no natural or inherent route of evolution or development. Phrasing it in this way, it sounds obvious, and yet it is not. Whether it is American miscalculation in Afghanistan, as the US sought to impose foreign political systems onto very different cultural groups, or German miscalculation in thinking that their own understanding of political rationality applied to Putin's Russia, we see time and time again that those whose specialty is politics catastrophically undervalue the role of distinct local cultures and traditions in determining what is actually politically viable. A tendency to universalize one's own narrow experience blinds them. A study of Macedon and Qin, thus, while at first seeming far removed from things that matter, is important in allowing us to dispassionately highlight what makes societies by studying what makes societies different. Thank you for listening.
Let me, first of all, congratulate you for this informative talk, for the work you've done, and for even the last comment you make, bringing us to a very topical conclusion. But I wanted you to address a couple of questions that I have for you. First of all, I apologize for mispronouncing Qin.
Yeah.
And I allow you to pronounce Macedonia as Macedon and not Macedonia. So forget the pronunciation issues. But two things. In Greece, Macedon was seen as a non-Greek because of not following the polis structure. So that I wanted you to speak a bit about that. And the second question that maybe you can address is that Alexander's teacher was Aristotle, and pupil of Plato, who wrote the Republic, where the kind of oligarchical view that influenced the way that Alexander governed by giving language to some of the hoplites and this aristocratic elite that was the cavalry, goes hand in hand with Plato's Republic, where there is a caste system, and you can get the possibility of addressing your ruler, as it were, depending on the position you have, as you said, in society. I was interested to see, so maybe you can address that, and how Alexander, by conquering and reaching to areas where this kind of rationale was not, he found other ways of being a ruler, and he took on these new characteristics of a ruler from the countries that the cultures that he conquered. I see towards the end, you talk about political or philosophizing that influenced the Qin culture, where censorship came. And I'm wondering how you can compare the concept of ideas that informed the governing between these two countries, and obviously the state, the polis-state, as opposed to the kingdom. And just to say that the argument about Macedonia is because it had Greek language, followed Greek religions, as you said, imitated customs that would make them more Greek, is what the main difference was, the fact that there was no governing power to the people, since they had a kingdom, and that's why they were seen as other. So I'm just wondering if you can address both of these questions, because I find them as an interesting way of bringing the two cultures in a sort of a comparison in relief, since the concept of ideas goes hand in hand with the governing ideologies of the time. Thank you.
All right. That's a rather large question, to which I would suggest much of my answer is going to be in the book, but I'll try to summarize some comments for you. It is absolutely correct, and my conclusion in here, that the otherness of Macedon is stemming primarily from the difference in its customs, right? And by that I mean that you don't have polis governmental structures. The work of Miltiades Hatsopoulos seems to suggest that there may have been some cities that might have been something analogous to polis, but even that becomes irrelevant, because the kings are not kings of a city. They are kings of a territorial realm. As for the ideas that are making their way into Macedon, it is absolutely true that Alexander III is taught by the greatest philosophers of his age, and that he is coming out of a long intellectual lineage. But I would be careful to separate that out from the rise of the Macedonian Assembly. It is an influence on it, but the Macedonian Assembly seems to be something that Philip II comes up with. And Philip II is part of his own intellectual lineage coming out of the Greek tradition, because as a young man, he was a political hostage in Thebes at the time of the Theban hegemony. So he is absolutely seeing democratic structures. He is seeing the Greek military revolution, but he is not seeing it in the realm of the Athenian philosophical lineage. When Alexander is educated by Aristotle, it's very clear that he gets a lot of scientific interest, a lot of scientific fascination. But as it's famously remarked, Aristotle wanted him to treat the foreigners like plants, and Alexander didn't do that. He is much more in the realm of the Argead tradition, where you just use whatever's available to you to whatever best purpose fits your individual needs at the moment. And if you look at Alexander's reign in the larger context of the Argead line of kings, they're all behaving like that. It makes Alexander look distinct only in that he happens to be in Persia and is drawing from all kinds of non-Greek traditions. But the core desires here is still whatever works for me, right? In the Qin case, it's also really worthwhile to point out that the reformer Shang Yang, the guy who instituted the first totalitarian state in history, is not from Qin, right? He is another case of when the state of Qin wants to reform itself, the ruler doesn't do it on his own. He basically puts out like a help wanted ad throughout the rest of the realm and says, anybody who can help me reform my state, make me stronger, make me richer, I'll give you a job, right? And so various intellectuals from across China come to the state of Qin and sort of try to get this job. Various interviews are had, and Shang Yang wins when he basically preaches a doctrine of state terror that would allow the ruler to become maximally strong and the state to therefore have a maximally strong military, which was needed because you had a very long line of existential wars going back and forth in China at that time. The intellectual tradition that most people want to hear about when it comes to early China is the Confucian tradition. But the Confucian tradition, as I have argued in my work on the sort of diasporic origins of early Chinese identity, is something that Qin is immune from, because Qin is in the homeland, and the other Chinese states are the diasporic experiences of being cut off from the homeland. The Qin never feel the need to engage in the historical preservation that characterizes Confucianism. And so it marks Qin out as being this intellectually alien area where the rest of China is gradually moving in one way and the state of Qin is moving in the opposite way.
Thank you.
Yep.
I have a question.
All right.
It's more of like a personal question, but you've studied in a lot of different places and I'm sure you've met a lot of different kinds of people. What's like been some of the lessons that you've learned across your travels?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I understand. It's a good question. It's a very good question. I would say that the most important thing I have learned from going from country to country is intellectual humility. That by being raised not in one national tradition, but in a whole bunch of different ones, you realize that there are radically different approaches to any given topic than what you will learn not just here at LMU versus what you will hear here in California. What you will learn in the United States will not be what you are taught in Germany or Canada or China, which is very different. And so you have to be humble and not assume that you know something. And at the same time, you have to be wary to be consciously looking for other points of view when you are doing your research. That make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
So my question is kind of going back to the mimicry idea, and you know, we're talking about kind of like, oh, the political structures do not operate in vacuums. You know, this very cultural contamination, everything. My question is, do you think, I guess more generally, do you think mimicry is isolated to Macedon and Greece, or what conditions do you think are needed to make that state of mimicry, or like at least get that culture idea? I guess what I'm trying to get to is that when you get to Qin, it's very obvious that to some extent, at least in the earlier period, they do accept themselves as a periphery culture, and you can see other like barbarian culture in China that are a periphery kind of accept themselves as that or not part of China. And then I guess the other question is, do you think this can be applied to this concept of mimicry? Can it be applied to other cultural contexts? Can it be applied and can be applied to other time periods? So where do you think the limitations of that lie? And yeah, and like what, and again, what can, I know we talked about that, like the political structure, but like what conditions do you think are needed for that kind of relationship to occur?
All right, fantastic. First of all, the concept of mimicry is in Homi K. Bhabha, and I can send you the work if you want to see like the big volume on what this concept is. The conditions for it, I would say, you need to have one group that believes it is one way in terms of something essential, and you need to have another group that has incentive to try to make itself seem something that it is not, right? Or that it is not naturally. The issue with Macedon, what makes it fascinating, is that in terms of all of our anthropological categories, the Macedonians are obviously Greek. If you sort of take a modern lens to it from what we can see of the Macedonian language or the study of Macedonian names, they're Greeks. But they don't seem to be accepted as Greeks, showing, number one, the Greeks don't accept our anthropological categories for what makes up a culture. And you also get into this question of, by trying to be Greek in a way that they are not naturally, by being incentivized to put on a show, right? That is what begins to, weird out the observer and say, well, that's not the same thing as actually being one of us, right? The example that I used heavily is that of colonial India, where there is a very strong incentive for Indians to become as English as they can possibly be, right? Financial benefits, legal benefits, be a part of the imperial structure. But because of English racial ideas, you could never be English. No matter how, you can talk with your perfect received pronunciation, have your tea and your cricket bat, and they would never, ever, ever in a million years accept you as being English, right? These are very specific conditions. If you're asking for other conditions like that, look for racists in power, and you will find attempts at mimicry.
I know you were particularly looking at the political structures, but did you see any interesting shifts in domestic structure? And I know that's like not at all what your presentation in the book is about, so don't worry about it. Yeah, thanks.
I'm really glad you brought this up because I had to cut like 100 pages out of my dissertation for this book. I engaged in a domestic study, specifically the role of women. And there is a really fascinating comparison to be made with the political role of women in Macedon versus the rest of Greece and China. And the short version is the Macedonians seem to be okay with women having political roles, which is shocking when you look at the rest of Greece, where that is absolutely anathema. And you look at the rest of all of Chinese history, all of the Zhou dynasty, it's absolutely anathema. And the case which I argue is the reason why the Macedonians are okay with this is because they have these aristocratic structures. And so if you have men who are landholders, power holders in their own right, the power of pillow talk is a power that can benefit them and their clan. You might have a sister, you might have a daughter, you might have a niece. You marry them off to the king and you can wield your influence on the king. But when you look at Greece and China, you have offices, magistracies, not quite bureaucracies in Greece, but definitely in China. And someone who holds an office is not from a powerful family necessarily. Marrying their sister off is nothing more than their own personal wealth, which isn't very much. Right? When your power comes from office versus when your power comes from you just are powerful externally, there becomes a hostility towards the influence of women because you, as the office holder, can't wield it. Right? No matter how educated you are as a Chinese bureaucrat, no matter what office title you hold, the emperor's wife is still going to talk to him at the end of the day, and you're not going to be in the room.
Great, thank you so much.
Yep.
I wanted to build off of Zachariah's question about, well, first of all, congratulations,
Thank you
Dr.
very
Esfer. Thank you for the presentation. I want to build off Zachariah's question about like mimicry and this sort of sense of otherness in ancient Greece, like at this time. After the battles in Greece toward the beginning of, or I guess the end of Philip's campaigns and the beginning of Alexander's, at the Battle of Chaeronea, and then like the obvious successes that Alexander had abroad, how did the Greek city-states like Athens and Sparta, like how did they come to terms with that? If they had this belief that they are like inferior, they're barbarians, how, like as a society, how did they come to terms with it? And also like after Alexander's death, obviously there was this, period of Hellenization, like a dissemination of Greek culture. Did they see that as being like a severe like watering down of their culture over time, or and their language and everything over time, or did they see like any benefits of that as the centuries went on?
That's a very long, complicated answer you're asking me for. The short version I can give you is that the Hellenistic period, as far as Greek identity goes, seems to be like a case-by-case basis type of thing. Famously, Alexander has his generals all marry Persian wives, but then when he dies, almost all of them divorce them, but not all of them, right? In some kingdoms, like in Ptolemaic Egypt, which Andy Hogan, who I saw earlier, but he has to go somewhere, he works on, there is an institutional legal category of Greek, right? It's a different tax code than being non-Greek, but it's an institutionalized category, so you can put an Egyptian in the Greek category. It's not like always, tied to race. So there is a benefit to being Greek. As for what the Greeks of the mainland think about this, mixed opinions. The Greeks are, in my experience of working with the sources, very locally minded, right? They are primarily concerned with local issues, local rivalries, local traditions. And so they are less interested in what the status of someone a million miles away is going to be. Their citizenships don't work that way. I mean, Roman citizenships do, right? Questions of what is a Roman 1,000 miles from Rome, in a civil war, those come up in Roman texts. For the Greeks, citizenship is so bounded, identity is so bounded, that what you're really asking about are what are the Hellenistic kingdoms doing? And like I said, that's a case-by-case basis type of thing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jordan, Christopher. Thank you guys to be